Help! I wrecked my tank. Whoa. First off, no you didn't. I know Bryopsis is one of the trickier algae to deal with, but it is completely manageable. Even a severe outbreak can be beat back into submission. So before you throw your hands in the air and give up, let me help guide you through your best courses of action to fight back against that dastardly algae. But before we get started, what exactly is Bryopsis? Bryopsis is a genus of green marine algae in the family Bryopsitaceae, making up roughly 60 different species of often dark green, ferny, and filamentous looking algae. They grow in dense tufts and are excellent at trapping debris and nutrients that they can then feed off of to grow. They are incredibly invasive in our aquariums, and if left unchecked, will easily spread throughout the tank, irritating and suffocating corals, which can cause tissue loss and even wipe out corals entirely, especially since Bryopsis has a preference for growing on exposed coral skeleton. While this doesn't happen overnight, it will absolutely happen over time, which is why it is incredibly important to deal with any Bryopsis you do see as soon as you see it. I also think it's probably important we talk about where Bryopsis comes from in the first place, because it didn't just show up magically. So where did it come from? Like most pests you end up with in your reef tank, it got there because you put it there. I mean, you likely didn't know you put it there, or maybe you did see it, but you didn't think it was a big deal at the time. Nevertheless, the only way it gets into your reef tank is by your hand. For example, anytime you add live rock or live sand or a new coral or even new snails, you could be adding algae like Bryopsis to your tank. So, how do you make sure that your new additions don't also end up adding unwanted algae? Great question. Well, if your reef is newly set up with live rock or live sand, you can keep the lights off while cycling the tank to prevent unwanted algae from growing while there could be excess nutrients in the system. When adding new corals, you can remove those corals from their plugs or bases onto new ones that are algae-free. If you can't remove them, you can also dip the bases into or brush on some hydrogen peroxide and let it sit for a few minutes, which will kill off that algae. You can also make sure to add a good cleanup crew of herbivorous inverts to your reef before you start adding corals, or now if you haven't already. Just don't overdo it. Too many snails and urchins is a recipe for disaster. The algae may go away faster or perhaps not show up at all, but those critters will end up starving and dying, which means a nutrient increase, meaning fuel for algae. So yeah, just a few to start. Speaking of snails, their shells can actually have algae on them. Even if you can't see it, the beginnings of algae could be there, and a careful scrub with hydrogen peroxide is a good way to clean them up. Just make sure none goes inside the snail's opening or onto its body. Adding a utilitarian fish is also another great way. Specifically, herbivores like rabbitfish and tangs can also help prevent algae from getting out of control. But even if you try your hardest to keep it out and Bryopsis still manages to get into your tank, the most important thing is that you don't wait to begin treating the first signs. When you see Bryopsis, you should take action immediately, if not before. Even a tiny tuft of it will absolutely turn into piles of it everywhere if you leave it unchecked, which is why I assume you're here. So let's talk about how you can tackle a Bryopsis outbreak. There are essentially 4 ways that you can approach treating a Bryopsis outbreak. 1, natural predators. 2, physical removal. 3, filtration and nutrient control. And 4, chemical treatments. Depending on the severity of your outbreak, some of these options are going to work better than others, and the best course of action that I can recommend is actually a combination of them. But first, let's take a look at natural predators. So what are your options for natural predators? Well, the truth is you're pretty limited here because most of the herbivorous fish and inverts either won't eat Bryopsis or can be very hit and miss. That being said, in general, it's a good idea to have a mix of fish like tangs, blennies, and rabbitfish that are known to graze on algae in your reef tank. Of those fish, only rabbitfish have really been known to actively graze on Bryopsis, and even they may or may not decide to take a liking to it. When it comes to invertebrates, a mix of snails including Mexican turbos, trochus, money cowries, and tropical abalones are my go-to for most algae issues, but again, hit and miss when it comes to Bryopsis. Urchins like tuxedos are often a good choice for a variety of algae types and may help beat back Bryopsis as well. However, one option you might read about that I would not recommend is sea hares. Although they can be algae-eating machines, these very large nudibranchs have low survivability in a reef tank and seem to get taken out by all sorts of things, from crawling into powerheads and overflows to being picked on by fish and even winding up inside of anemones. And when they die, that is a lot of meat that's going to begin breaking down and fouling the tank, which means a huge mess that can make algae worse or potentially cause other problems. Long story short, natural predators aren't the best solution for Bryopsis all on their own and should really be considered potentially a part of the solution. So what works better? Well, you can play the role of a natural predator by physically removing the algae yourself, and there is a specific way to do this. The best tactic for physical removal is the pinch and siphon technique. Use a siphon to drain water from the tank, then use your thumb against the hose to pinch off tufts of the algae, which then get immediately sucked out of the tank. This works really well because the algae is removed directly and you don't risk accidentally spreading it around. Which brings me to an important point. Do not scrub it off the rocks. This can actually cause algae to spread around faster, as bits of algae are often all that's required to start a new patch of algae growth. And the last thing you want is more Bryopsis popping up in new places that it wasn't growing before. Filtration and nutrient control is another way that you can help inhibit the spread of Bryopsis. Like any algae, elevated levels of nutrients like phosphate and nitrate can fuel the growth and spread of Bryopsis, so testing for phosphate and nitrate and making sure they're within reasonable ranges is super important. Phosphate between 0.02 and 0.06 and nitrate between 5 and 10 ppm will be a good place to land. It keeps enough nutrients in the system for your corals, but without it being so high that algae can really take advantage. It is important to note that this won't solve a Bryopsis outbreak, it will just help slow it down. If your nutrients are too high, you can do water changes to help bring them back down. Or if you find they consistently come back up even after water changes, you can improve your filtration by adding a refugium, an algae tier scrubber, a macroalgae reactor, or even a chemical media reactor to help take up that excess nutrients. Fleece rollers are also a fantastic form of filtration for removing waste, including uneaten foods that go down the overflow before it ever gets to break down into nitrate and phosphate in the water, which is an easy and reliable way to control nutrients mechanically. And now we move on to what is the most effective solution for a Bryopsis outbreak: chemical treatments. These are exactly what they sound like, using a chemical or medication to wipe out Bryopsis, and there are essentially two different options that reefers have access to: household hydrogen peroxide, or H2O2, and fluconazole. Hydrogen peroxide is a topical treatment that is relatively easy and safe to use. You can simply drain the aquarium as low as possible to expose the rocks, then use a spray bottle to spritz hydrogen peroxide directly onto patches of algae. While many corals are very tolerant of hydrogen peroxide, some aren't, so do take care not to spray the corals directly. If there is algae tied against the bases of corals or growing between corals, you can use a soft paintbrush or a syringe to apply it in those tight spaces. And fear not, hydrogen peroxide will dissipate quickly in water and turn back into water itself when it releases that extra oxygen molecule. Over the next few days, the Bryopsis will turn pale and then begin to melt away. All that dying algae is going to equal excess nutrients in the water, which is not a good thing. So it is important that you make sure you do a water change, as well as add some extra filter media, specifically GFO to remove phosphates, and another good general chemical media like ROX Carbon, Purit, Purigen, or even ChemiPure. Now, fluconazole is the golden sledgehammer when it comes to Bryopsis. It works incredibly well, it's safe for your reef when used as directed, and it's relatively inexpensive. What more could you ask for? After treating the tank, the Bryopsis will die off within 10 to 14 days. And just like I was saying before, all that dead algae will release nutrients back into the water, so be prepared to do water changes and add GFO and carbon. It's really that simple, it just works. There is, however, a chemical treatment that you're likely to hear about that I absolutely do not recommend: For many years, it was thought that a magnesium range of 1600 ppm was effective at killing off Bryopsis. This is not a reliable method. While it did work somewhat at the time, it appeared to only work with one specific magnesium additive by Kent Marine called Tech M, and was not directly linked to elevated magnesium, but rather suspected heavy metal impurities in the product. So while you may have come across that opinion during your research on how to kill off Bryopsis, it isn't a good idea, especially since fluconazole is arguably safer and way more effective. But wait, before you go off and buy fluconazole, I want to give you what I would consider the ideal approach to wiping out all of your Bryopsis, which, if you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned was a combination of all of these approaches. First, be the predator and pinch and siphon out as much Bryopsis as possible. This way you reduce the amount of die-off that you're going to have to deal with in the tank. Next, since you're already draining the tank, expose the rocks and spot treat with hydrogen peroxide. Give it a few days to die back and use that GFO and carbon, as well as do water changes as needed to remove the waste from the die-off. Finally, after a week or so, go ahead and treat your tank with fluconazole to make sure all of the Bryopsis is taken care of from all of the nooks and crannies. And again, GFO, carbon, and water changes to manage any excess nutrients. After you're finally Bryopsis free, I would still recommend bolstering your cleanup crew with those key snails and urchins, as well as the fish that I mentioned earlier, just as a precaution against it or any other algae taking over your tank ever again. Now, I know that was a lot of info, but if you follow it and keep up with it, even if it doesn't happen immediately, you will be able to get ahead of this Bryopsis outbreak, and once you do, you're gonna feel like $1,000,000 and your tank will thank you for it. And Bryopsis likely won't be the only pest you face on your reefing journey. So if you'd like help with all of those other pests and learn how to deal with them effectively or prevent them entirely, you can check out the other videos just like this one in this playlist right here. Check it out.